Today I'm joined by Dr Matthew Phillips, metabolic neurologist. If you haven't heard Matt speak before, you're going to love this pod. If you've heard him speak before, you'll also love this pod. He's an extraordinary man, achieving extraordinary things in metabolic medicine, especially in the areas of mitochondrial quality, mitohormesis, key concepts in reversing degenerative neurological diseases. Matt's also the keynote at our Future of Medicine in Hamilton coming up mid-August 2025. Sold out once, we expanded the venue, it'll sell out again. If you want to come along in person, get there. Right, we don't ask for anything, there's no advertising, but if I can ask you for one small favour, please subscribe, rate us and share this podcast. It makes all the difference for us keeping this momentum going on the work. Enjoy. My absolute pleasure to be joined by Dr Matthew Phillips, metabolic neurologist. Evening, Matt.
G'day, Grant. How are you?
I'm going well. You've been on this pod before. People will know you as the metabolic neurologist. They'll see, and I'll just put this out front because I get so many questions about this. Where do we find all of this stuff, all of this rules? So if you go to metabolicneurologist.com, then everything is there. Your videos, your papers, your protocols, everything, right?
Maybe not everything, but yeah, I mean, certainly most. There's always videos I can't find somewhere on the internet.
So last time we spoke here, you were the world's only metabolic neurologist. First of all, you just want to tell us what a metabolic neurologist is, why they're different, and are there any others yet?
Well, a metabolic neurologist is a coin I turned several years back when I wanted to define what I was doing under a sort of a single headline. And I guess I just at the time saw a metabolic neurologist as someone who uses protocols that are aimed at enhancing the metabolism. That's all the chemical reactions in the brain and body. And the first and foremost of those protocols involve fasting protocols and ketogenic diet protocols, low carbohydrate diet protocols, and other similar things in order to sort of revert us into a different metabolic state that was more akin to that of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and that had a lot of benefits that we've lost with our modern lifestyle. So I coined that term and just decided to maintain it ever since. If I was to redo the term, I'd consider myself a mitochondrial metabolic neurologist or something like that. And As for there being any others, I know there's a couple of there's at least one fellow I know calling himself a low-carb neurologist, but I don't know of any other people calling themselves metabolic neurologists yet.
How are you feeling about that? Well, first of all, how did this all happen? Because anyone who's been treated in neurology or seen a neurologist in the last 10 years will probably appreciate that it's probably not an approach. And actually it's quite off the reservation, so to speak, for modern neurology. How did this come to be?
How did we get here in terms of the medical system?
No, well, we'll talk about that in a sec, but how did you manage to veer so far off the conventional path for neurology?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I am not entirely sure is the answer. However, all I can say is that when I was very little, I did think, my father was a doctor, my mother was a nurse, and I thought that when my father went to work every day, he was healing people. And I don't know why I thought that, but that's what I thought he did. He was going to work and healing people. And then it was in my second year of medical school when I realized, with this significant shock, I must say, and sense of frustration, that that's not what most doctors did. They were using allopathic treatments, so treatments that were based at reducing symptoms or masking symptoms, which is a good thing in of itself, but it wasn't what I thought doctors did. And that was probably, that was a low point for me in terms of it can't be like it can't be like this. All we do is mask the symptoms. We don't actually alter the disease course. But that's what it was for most things. So I decided to finish my medical school and do my neurology training. And at the end of the training, I took out 3 years away from the system, more or less. I worked for about a year in the middle of that, but it was a different kind of work. And during those 3 years, I was able to sort of return to my childhood notions, those childish notions that seemed so silly when I was a second-year med student. And I returned to them and I thought, no, this is what I want to do, no matter what. It's got to be somehow like this. I have to try and make myself into something like that, like what I thought a doctor did when I was like 8. And that's what led to this, because fasting and keto diet protocols in metabolic neurology seemed to me, and I explored many options, it seemed to me to be the most likely thing that could actually encourage that sort of restorative healing process.
And did you know about mitochondria, mitogenesis, mitophagy, and these processes then?
I, of course, knew about mitochondria from my biochemistry courses, both in my biology degrees and in medical school. But no, I didn't really, and I'd learned about autophagy and all these things, but I didn't really have a deep appreciation for it. All I knew was that mitochondria were the powerhouses of the cell, and that they were one of many organelles in the cell, and the cell could undergo autophagy. And that was sort of the extent of it. I never really thought about how we could encourage that process, why that process could be really good, why it's good for the body to sometimes be anabolic in a growth stage and at other times be catabolic in a breaking down stage, which involves autophagy and, in terms of mitochondria, mitophagy. So no, I didn't know any of that stuff. It really was during that 3 years, I took a deep dive when I wasn't, adventuring, traveling, and volunteer work and all that stuff. I was reading and looking at videos on the internet and reading papers and books and things like that. So learned a lot of it there.
How long is it going to take your field, in your opinion, to start taking this more and more seriously, and then for it to become mainstream?
Good question. It'll be on the order of decades.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to predict the future. I don't want to try, but I think it will be decades. If you look at like how long it took, Dr. Simwells started this hand washing as a basic thing in medical care. It took about 50 years, 50 years. And this now is something so obvious to us that when you are treating patients, you should wash your hands to stop the spread of, excessive spread of bacteria. But back before this became a routine practice, it was not common sense at all. And a lot of doctors, top doctors, laughed at it and mocked the practice. They thought it was silly. It wasn't necessary at all. And yet people were dying because they weren't washing their hands. And so, that took 50 years. How long will this take? If it entrenches itself, similar amount of time, I'd guess. We're probably about 10 years into it already.
Yeah, well, let's hope the work of Igor Simwells is instructive, but over a different time course, because information moved at a different pace. For people who don't know, I think he was based in Vienna in sort of the mid-19th century, and the maternal plague, which turns out to be bacterial infections, was killing many women just post-childbirth, and in many cases, in some hospitals, that was up to 70% of women. And he showed pretty clearly, with stepwise time series data that were really well collected, that he can have a massive and immediate impact on that. And this is where I hope the story goes differently than your one. He left medicine in the end, ended up in an asylum, and perversely himself died of sepsis, the very thing that he was trying to sort out.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So you know the story very well, obviously.
Yeah, well, I think it's just a cautionary tale for medicine, and that we should know better. And I think at the moment where we've got to, with the I would say you and I both talk about the debate between Louis Pasteur and Antoine Béchamp, through a similar period around germ theory and terrain theory, and it's arguable that we've followed germ theory in medicine to its bitter end, really. What do you think about that, germ theory to its bitter end?
Definitely. Yeah, so it takes a long time for dogmatic ways of thinking to change. And I'm not, your audience probably knows about the debate between Pasteur and Béchamp with reference to germ theory and terrain theory, but germ theory is basically a theory that Louis Pasteur championed and thought that germs were sort of the cause of disease, and that if you had the germs you got the disease, and it was a very sort of basic cause and effect kind of theory. And then Béchamp sort of had the opposite theory in a way. He said no, it's not so much the germs, it's the terrain being the health of the body. And if the terrain is strong, then a lot of those germs just can't take hold. They become scavengers, and the germs are only nasty if the terrain is weak, the health is poor. So yeah, these guys had this debate for a couple decades in the 1800s, and Pasteur won for various reasons. I think I'll talk about this a little bit on the day, but I think Béchamp lacked, he tried to come up with microzymas and other things that could be the sort of the essence of his terrain, but he was making stuff up. He had a lot of silly ideas, Béchamp. And what he called as microzymes. Yeah. Are those really, in modern day terms, what we think of as mitochondria, or now that we have electron microscopy and everything? Yeah, short answer, no. But there's a lot of overlap with what he thought microzymas. I think he predicted the properties they should have. And some of what he said sounds exactly like the mitochondria or mitochondria. But the problem is mitochondria weren't discovered at that time. And it took a few decades for mitochondria to really be discovered and properly named. So, and that all occurred more or less after this debate. So maybe if we'd known about mitochondria at that time, his theory, which was host theory, and we can think of it now as something called terrain theory. So another thing that Antoine Béchamp had a problem with was because he didn't really clearly define what, the host or the health was or the terrain was. He wasn't able to come up with specific strategies to improve it. So he said things like get more exercise, get more sunlight, things like that. But it was a little bit vague and wishy-washy, whereas Pasteur, with his germ theory, had specific treatments coming out, such as vaccines and things like that. So there were a lot of issues back then. And if Antoine Béchamp had simply known about mitochondria, if the science on mitochondria had been a couple hundred years more advanced, maybe terrain theory would have taken a much greater hold now than it has.
And I suppose some of those things you're talking about we would also now call hormesis, right? This sort of idea of hormetic medicine, a medicine that confers stress but allows benefit by adaptation of the species. And that's the bigger is that the bigger version of what you talk about in mitophagy and mitohormesis?
Yeah, I think so. Hormesis and hormesis is this concept whereby you impose a sort of acute stress on an organism or a cell or something, and if you do that and then allow that organism or cell to have a proper recovery period, it grows stronger, and you keep doing this over time, it becomes stronger and healthier. And you can apply hormesis to mitochondria. That's called mitohormesis. And mitohormesis is a coin that was termed about 20 years ago, not that long ago, about 2005, when it was discovered basically that a lot of the coordination of cell hormesis and organism hormesis occurs at the mitochondrial level. Because the mitochondria are the processes of the cell and they control so many of the cell functions, hormesis really should, in most cases, when you say hormesis, you really mean mitohormesis. And mitohormesis is an absolutely fundamental strategy. And I think, the fasting and ketogenic diets, an umbrella term for them is metabolic therapy or ketogenic metabolic therapy. But even that ketogenic metabolic therapy is one subset of what it's trying to do is mitohormesis at the end of the day. There's a lot of stuff it does, but mitohormesis may be the most fundamental thing that it does. And there's other strategies, exercise recovery-based strategies, cognitive recovery-based strategies, and so on that induce mitohormesis as well.
Do you reckon part of the mental block for medicine is the basic caricature that is the cell diagram, and on that cell diagram that you learn at school, you learn it in your biology degree, you learn at medical school, it has 2 or 3 mitochondria floating around in the cytoplasm in the cell diagram, when the actual reality is something that is wildly different than that?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking a lot of good questions here, Grant. So, look, we have a very another problem is it's not that we're germ theory oriented. We have a very cell-centric point of view of life. We think that cells are really the fundamental unit of life, and you could make a powerful argument that perhaps the mitochondria are. It just depends how far you want to zoom in. The thing about cells is they are very amenable to textbooks. You put up a picture of a cell and you put a few organelles in the cell, and it's all static, of course, because when you draw a picture, nothing moves. Whereas mitochondria, in reality, cells move, of course, but mitochondria move a lot more. They're constantly merging and separating. They're constantly changing their shape. Mitochondria are sort of like the physical manifestations of energy, right? They coordinate. At the end of the day, it's not just metabolism, but energy throughout the cell and the organism. And so how do you draw energy? You can't. So it's the way we learn through books and things like that is not amenable to learning about the fundamental essence of life, if it is defined as energy and bioenergetic processes. So there's a lot of reasons there too why we might see why a mitocentric terrain-based approach to medicine hasn't taken hold.
I'm not sure how they got these images. I'm assuming they're with electron microscope, but live. And I don't know if you've seen these, but what you're actually seeing is mitochondria moving around in a live cell. And it's almost like a large school of fish, where it's almost sentient, and it's moving to one part of I think it was a neuron in this case, where the energy demand is different, and then back over to the other side. Frankly, when I first saw that presentation, I found it breathtaking. It
is breathtaking. I mean, so we had microscopes that were not electron microscopes for decades, where we couldn't see the mitochondria very well, right? So now that we've got those, we can sort of see more about what they're doing, but we still can't see, even with them, we can't really visualize energy. And I remember when I was a graduate student in the biology department at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, I remember one of the local mitochondria specialists called me over to his lab, and he was so excited because he was looking at something under the microscope and said, showing me some fish cells. And he said, look at those things inside the cells. And I was like, I looked at them and they were moving around, and I said, what are they? And he said, I don't know, some kind of parasite maybe. And then he came back to me a few days later and he said they were actually mitochondria. And he didn't know that. And he's a mitochondria specialist. So this was in the 90s, but still, it just shows you like how the early stages of mitochondrial science that we're in. And if we're in such early stages with respect to mitochondrial science, how can we expect mitochondrial-based medicine to be any earlier? We can't, because the medicine follows the science, or should. So if the science is only at this stage, the medicine's going to be even further back, right? So it's just we're entering this new, fascinating, exciting era of mitochondrial-based views of life and science and medicine, hopefully culminating in a science of healing or a medicine, a medical process based on true healing, and which will take a few decades, as we mentioned at the start. And I think, we're just in the infancy of it.
Okay, while I've got you here, we're sort of geeking out on this stuff. One other thing that's been fascinating, man, I just want to figure out if it's even true or not, and what you make of it, is this idea of light in the infrared spectrum, penetrating into the cell, into the mitochondria, and then actually doing things presumably moving electrons in the electron transport chain of the mitochondria. First of all, is that real? And second of all, if it is, we've got something traveling billions of kilometers with no mass and no charge. That's just crazy stuff.
So yeah, like red light therapy is a thing, right? Like a lot of people are applying red light therapy to a number of different disorders, including neurological ones such as Parkinson's. So it is a thing. The thing is, to my knowledge, although it may enhance mitochondria temporarily, you're going to need repeated treatments. And the crucial thing about it is it will not significantly enhance mitohormesis, right? So there are many mitochondria, many off-label treatments people use to try and enhance their mitochondria. You could take high-dose thiamine, for example. You could take methylene blue. You could take red light therapy. And the list goes on. There's a lot. But it's really, in my perspective, the mitohormesis that's going to be the major deal breaker here and enhance true health. I don't think these things are bad. I think they might help, but they're more like a germ theory approach. Even though they target mitochondria, it's ultimately, at the end of the day, just another facet of germ theory. You're trying to apply an external treatment and you're targeting something. You are trying to enhance something rather than eliminate something. So it's sort of a merger between germ theory and terrain theory, I guess. But it's not true mitohormesis. And I think at the end of the day, mitohormesis is the key element that you need to instill that endogenous internal healing process. And that's going to be your foundation. And then you can layer all these other treatments, red light therapy and other things on top of the foundation. But if you don't take care of the foundation, none of those things in themselves aren't going to be enough.
Okay, let's get to the foundation then. So metabolic therapy, so you've really pioneered the pointy end of that, I suppose. What do your therapies look like in neurology?
Well, we focus on, there's many different aspects of mitohormesis. So you can look at exposure to toxin levels. So exposure to toxin, break from toxin. And, that's one thing. And then you can look at cognitive lifestyle, physical lifestyle, your psychosocial lifestyle, so social engagement, break from that. And we look at dietary lifestyle mainly because I think dietary lifestyle is where we've arguably gone the most off track in certainly the last 50 years and arguably in the last few thousand years. So we look at modifying dietary lifestyle because I think that's the one where it's the most abnormal. The dietary lifestyle we engage in today is the most non-evolutionary based aspect of the lifestyle we have. I mean, of course, there's technology and stuff, but I'm focusing on mitohormesis here. So what that means, I think the main thing, and this is where I depart from many people, is that I think we eat too many times a day. And it's not normal in hunter-gatherer evolution, this is before agriculture, to eat 3, 4, 5, or 6 times a day. And, nobody really knows how many times our hunter-gatherer ancestors ate, but if you look at modern hunter-gatherers, that can give you a clue. So first, that's one thing. We eat too many times a day, and that creates a chronic nutritional onslaught or influx, if you want to use a less colorful word, on our mitochondria. The mitochondria have to metabolize those nutrients at the end of the day, and it's very difficult. They need rest periods from nutrition in order to do their mitophagy and repair and recovery processes and so on. They need the time off to do that. So that's one thing. The other thing we focus on is the macronutrient ratios are all off in our modern lifestyle. So that's carbohydrates, protein, and fat ratios. Food is basically one of those 3 things, mainly one of those 3 things. And our lifestyles now are sort of highish carb, about 50% carbohydrate by energy intake, highish fat, so 30% fat, and maybe 20% protein, something like that. So basically they're highish carb and highish fat. When you have high carb and high fat, it's very difficult for mitochondria to deal with that because they are metabolized through 2 very different pathways. And so what we do is we try to choke one pathway, in this case the carbohydrate pathway, by really drastically cutting down carbohydrate intake and drastically upping fat intake and keeping protein high enough to do the things you need to do with it. And that results in a carbohydrate restricted diet, of which there are two main kinds. So there's the low carb diet, which is defined as carbohydrate intake of sort of anything under 100 or maybe 150 grams daily. And then a ketogenic diet, which is a very low carbohydrate diet, which is anything really under 50 grams of carbohydrate daily, and the lower the better. So that we apply these fasting protocols and carbohydrate restricted diets, basically ketogenic diets. I don't apply low carb, I go for ketogenic for neurological disorders. And we apply these to people with various neurological disorders to see if we can improve the symptoms of people and using those symptoms as a surrogate for their improved health. See if we can improve them through those strategies alone rather than medications and drugs.
And you've been pretty effective at that. So I think people, I don't think we need to talk fully about all the trials, but you showed definitely some symptom improvement in Parkinson's patients, particularly the psychological side, which is important. You showed at least a halting of progress, I think, in your Alzheimer's trial. You've been running a glioblastoma multiform study for a while now. Why don't we talk about where you're up to with that? And in fact, I saw one of your patients, I can't remember his name, from Nelson, writing about his story the other day, which is very compelling. Why don't we just talk about the GBM work first?
Yeah, sure. So half my work roughly is in the neurodegenerative disorders, the Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, and Huntington's. The other half is in cancer, basically. So with respect to cancer, yes, we're running this glioblastoma trial. That's basically the most common primary brain cancer you can get, and it's almost, it's one of the worst you can get. The median survival time is about 14 to 15 months. And what we're doing with these people is applying a very powerful metabolic therapy program that is well timed with their standard treatments, their radiation therapy, their chemotherapy. And we've timed it in a very specific manner to try and maximize the impact of the metabolic therapy on the standard treatments, to make the standard treatments more effective, because there's a lot of evidence that the fasting in particular can protect the cells from radiation and chemotherapy and also make cancer cells more susceptible to the treatments at the same time. That's called differential stress resistance for normal cells and differential stress sensitization for cancer cells. So we're doing what they do is they get their diagnosis and then they start their standard treatment, which is 6 weeks of radiation, and we do 2 5-day fasts during that 6 weeks. And all other days, they're eating 1 meal a day, that's OMAD, or 2 meals a day, TMAD. And after that 6 weeks, they have a 4-week break from the standard treatments to recover, and they continue OMAD or TMAD. And then they have 6 months of what we call adjuvant chemotherapy, which is where you get this chemo drug called temozolomide for 5 days every 28 days. So that's a cycle. And we do a 5-day fast, basically lining it up with the 5-day cycle of the temozolomide. That's why the fasts are 5 days. And then they do OMAD or TMAD all other days. So after about 9 or 10 months of this, the standard treatments are done, and their metabolic therapy has been extremely powerful. I know of no other trial or group of people in the world, aside from case reports, that have done a program that intensively for that long. And after they get to that point, I sit down with them and say, what do you want to do? And pretty much everyone decides to continue with some form of metabolic therapy at that point, although 2 or 3 went low carb. Everyone else stayed ketogenic, and pretty much everyone sticks with the fasting, which is interesting. So that's the trial. It's about 4 years in. Our first patient, she's at about the 4-year mark. The fellow you mentioned, Simon, he was actually second to last patient enrolling in the trial. So he's only at about 1.5 years, but this is a great thing to see. He's a perfect example of mitohormesis. And the whole concept of mitohormesis is getting yourself healthier and stronger through adversity and recovery, stress and recovery, right? So I don't think he'll mind me saying this. He was a bit overweight and not, in terribly good health, perhaps, when he was diagnosed. Obviously, he wasn't. He got a glioblastoma. But when he embarked on the metabolic therapy program, he doubled down, and he's followed it extremely well, one of the best in the trial. And so he's done all the fasting really well. He's done the keto diet. He's tracking his glucose and ketone levels. We track them every day to get this glucose ketone index, the ratio of glucose over ketones in your blood, to get this GKI. And you want the GKI low. He's got one of the lowest, and he's just maintained it. And he decided also to incorporate, after a few months, he decided to really get hardcore into exercise, and he's a big runner. So he decided to get into very long runs, and he started out small, but he's now running at a fairly elite level, if you ask me. And his body weight is really low. He's very lean, and his last MRI was just a week ago or something, and it looks really great. I can't convincingly see any tumor to my eyes, so we're still waiting on the report. So this is the kind of thing that you like to see. Now, not every patient is having that degree of success as him, but this is the kind of, I think, strategy you want to do. And the key element about this trial is that we're using not terrain theory, the metabolic therapy, plus a bit of germ theory, which is the radiation and chemo. Now, some people will argue, well, you should only use terrain theory and the metabolic therapy, and other people, more mainstream people, will argue you should only use the standard treatments. But I see no reason that we can't combine both these theories to perhaps give an optimal result, at least for some people like him.
Okay, a couple of questions there on that's fascinating. Is on that glucose ketone index, you expect their glucose to drop below 5, I suppose, or somewhere around there. And what level do you expect to see their ketones come up to, and what do you like to see that at? Okay,
so it's a big unknown as to what the ideal GKI is. We know when the GKI gets below 6 in animals that it starts to have an impact on the tumor. In people, the ideal GKI probably needs to be somewhere below 2. So that means if your glucose is 5, as you say, then your ketones have to be at least 2.5 or higher. So 5 divided by 2.5 is 2. And if the glucose was 5 and the ketones were 4, then your GKI is hovering around the 1.3 mark. So really good. So our guys...
is that during the fast, or is that's just in the across their general OMAD
that's
type
an excellent
situation?
That's an average of all day. So in our trial, the average GKI in the first 6 weeks or so, in the first few months, is below 2. And that is achieved through a combination of the fasting and ketogenic diet. The 5-day fasts, lower it a lot more than the keto diet can, right? So when you're not eating for 5 days, your GKI can get really low because your ketones go high and your glucose goes, around into the 3s. And for most people. So you get this sort of pulse press approach, and we're trying to do this pulse press approach. So the fasts are treated as a pulse being a severe metabolic stress on the tumor cells, right? Lower glucose, higher ketones, and then because they need glucose, and there's no good evidence at all that they can consume ketones for growth. They might be able to limp by a little bit on ketones, but they can't consume them for growth. And then there's a press where you're doing the keto diet, even the 1 or 2 meal a day keto diet. The glucose will go up a bit, the ketones will come down a bit. So it's a press, it's a more mild metabolic stress on the cancer cells, but it's still a stress. So you're doing a pulse press, and of course, during the press, the pulse induced by the fast, you layer that in with the radiation and chemo, and now you've got a very powerful pulse, theoretically, where you're not only choking the tumor fuel source and making life difficult for cancer cells and protecting normal cells through the fast, but you're also hammering away with another stress on the cancer cells. That it's a catastrophic stress. It's too much for them, the radiation and chemo. So that's the idea that we're doing there, and we'll just have to see how the study pans out. I think we will likely be publishing it next year.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to that. I mean, it's an astonishing thing. And having seen a few of your patients now present, what's also really compelling, and I've sort of wondered what you think about this, is, one of the objections from people in medicine around fasting and keto diets is no one will do it, they'll hate it, it's not sustainable. Yet, I know these are under more life-threatening conditions, but these people are not just embracing it, they're actually raving about it and talking very positively about the dietary experience, which is an interesting thing.
Yeah, you're right. So in our trial, they do a 5-day fast every month, basically, for the 9 to 10 months. There's 8 total. Not one person in the whole trial missed a single fast. That's pretty incredible when you think 18 people total, all of them did, 8 fasts or more. Minimum was 8 5-day fasts. So yeah, they absolutely can stick to it. What people need to stick to things like this is someone to believe in them and someone to guide them. Someone to say, I know you can do it, because it's part of our evolution. Our ancestors would have gone 5 days without food many times, or we wouldn't be here. And probably the human body has evolved to need that periodically. And so I think you can do it, and I'll help you through it, especially the first couple. The first couple are the hardest, obviously. And once people have done a couple, they get them under their belt, then they don't need the guides so much anymore. Because you become more of a person who simply encourages them when it's glioblastoma, people get down, people get depressed, people get anxious. So you got to be there to help lift them up through those tricky times. But the actual fasting protocols, they don't have as big a problem as you might suspect. A lot of people say, I could never do a 5-day fast. Yes, you could. Yes, you could. It's not that hard. If you couldn't, you wouldn't. If your ancestors hadn't done it, you wouldn't be here probably. You would have died out. Those people wouldn't have survived.
It's interesting, though. I did one last week, actually, a 5-day fast. Came out feeling great.
Okay.
But it was interesting. I hadn't done one for a little while, and my confidence going into it was really, really low, like 2 out of 10. And there was no problems at all. It went fine. I came out feeling great. Actually, and then I did write up about it on social media that I was feeling great, and I got someone labelled it as white privilege, which I thought was an interesting response. Someone in medicine, by the way. But are you fasting? You still
That's
do
interesting.
some regular
Yeah.
fasting? Yeah, yeah.
Well, fasting actually breaks through any privilege, because there's no reason you can't do it. It saves money for everybody because it doesn't cost you anything. So, but I think yes is the answer. I'm a nomad guy. I love one meal a day. I will do 2 meals a day, 1 or 2 days a week, usually after an exercise day, because I've actually upped my exercise frequency to 3 times a week now. So I'll have TMAD after a couple of those days, but usually it's 1 meal a day. And I have to admit, my prolonged fasting, my multi-day fasting has gone down. I'll do maybe a 3 to 4 day fast now every 3 months. I used to do longer and more frequent. Why is that? I don't know. I just don't have the urge to do the longer fasts as I used to have anymore. I don't know if it's maybe, I like to think it's my metabolic health has improved and that I no longer require those. But, I think as long as one sticks to some kind of fasting protocol, even if it's just a daily fasting protocol, unless you have a neurological disorder or diabetes or something you're trying to combat, then that's absolutely sufficient to maintain health and mitochondrial health in particular for quite some time.
Okay, hey, there's a really great paper that you were the first author on, came out last year, a review paper called Neurogenetic Disorders, metabolic icebergs and mitohormesis. And you talk about Alzheimer's disease, you talk about Parkinson's disease, but you also talk about ALS and Huntington's disease. Can we talk about that paper, what you mean by metabolic icebergs? I think you've covered some of that stuff in terms of mitochondrial health already. And then let's talk about Huntington's, because I've seen someone with Huntington's and I thought it was a particularly brutal neurological disease. I don't know anyone with ALS. Well, actually my cousin, but I haven't seen him since he was diagnosed. Maybe we could talk about those and the responses you've seen. I think you've done a couple of papers on those as well.
Sure. Yeah, so that paper was co-written with Dr. Martin Picard, who's a mitochondria specialist out in Columbia University in New York. Fellow Canadian, actually, originally Canadian. So the paper is about how we can, people like to, in medicine, we like to split disorders into their many different unique characteristics, but you can, so there are splitters. There's a lot of people we call splitters in medicine, but it is possible to lump many of these disorders together by looking at common threads, common etiologies in the case of the neurodegenerative disorders. So what the paper was doing was trying to lump together the cause of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, motor neuron disease, or ALS, and Huntington's, and tying it back to one root cause, which is impaired mitochondrial biology, and explaining how you get the different splitting-based features of each of these four disorders, because they manifest very differently in a person. How this occurs when it's the same process originating, right? Because why would one person have mitochondrial damage and get Alzheimer's, and why would the next get Parkinson's? And one of the key things we've just learned, again, we just don't know enough about mitochondria. In the last 5 to 10 years, and a lot of the work's come out of Martin Picard's lab, is that mitochondria are not the same in all regions of the brain. They're different in the cerebellum compared to the cortex, compared to the amygdala, compared to basal ganglia. Others, all these structures that are different in the brain have slightly different mitochondria. They're called mitotypes. And mitotypes is a key concept because, it's not, the mitochondria that are living inside this neuron and that neuron have different functions. Like some neurons might require more energy than others, but other neurons might require greater plasticity. Whatever that neuron's function is, the mitochondria are attuned to that. So why would one mitotype get affected in Parkinson's more? Why would one mitotype get affected in Alzheimer's more, and so on? That was what the paper was exploring. And as for ALS and Huntington's, which are the two you wanted me to talk about a little more, they're the two less common neurodegenerative disorders. So, but there are reasons for that. So ALS is the third most common by incidence, by appearance. But ALS people die within 2 to 3 years on average. So that's why there's not many people that with ALS, because someone with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or Huntington's has a lot longer, but this one's fast, ALS. So ALS affects the motor neurons mainly. It affects many parts of the body in the nervous system and throughout the whole body. Muscles get affected in all 4 of these disorders. The heart gets affected in all 4 of these disorders. So they're all multisystemic disorders. It's just that the brain takes the biggest hit. And with ALS, you get weakness. It starts in the bulbar region, the mouth, the breathing, the chewing muscles, or it starts in the arms, or it starts in the legs, and it gradually spreads over a course of about 2 to 3 years on average. And it's very difficult because you just completely weaken until it hits your breathing, and you get pneumonias and things, and that's how people usually pass on. Huntington's is a little different. Huntington's is 3 things. It's a movement disorder, so they get random jerks all over the body. We call that chorea, as in choreography, because it looks dance-like when it gets severe enough. And they have a cognitive problem, that's the second thing, and they have a behavioral issues, that's the third thing, neuropsychiatric manifestations. So Huntington's is difficult because it's a movement thing, a cognitive thing, and a neuropsychiatric thing all wrapped up into one. So people live a lot longer with Huntington's, but it tends to be very hard on the person's social life, family life, and it's hard on the family themselves. And yeah, that's what the paper was. It was tying all four of these disorders into a common bioenergetic etiology of mitochondrial impairment. And therefore, we can apply metabolic therapies. It was a little bit about, and metabolic therapies and mitohormetic strategies in general to try and improve the health of those mitochondria, not only for preventing those disorders in the first place, but also maybe to treat people who already have the established disorder. And that's a lot harder, right? But that's what our studies focus on. And there's a lot of evidence that this can help people with these disorders. The evidence is stronger for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's because you actually have clinical trials supporting those. The evidence is much weaker for ALS and Huntington's. And in fact, there's a fair bit of evidence in animals with these disorders. You create an animal model with Huntington's or ALS. But in people, there's only 2 case studies, one for ALS and one for Huntington's, that have been published using these strategies. And we published both of them within the last 3 years, showing that at least in these people, N of 1, you have to be very skeptical and remember it's just one person. But there were definite stabilization and improvements noted, and you can read those papers because they're freely available. So that's what it was. And the iceberg concept you mentioned, why did we call them icebergs? Because when you look at an iceberg, I thought it's a nice analogy. When you look at an iceberg, you see the top of it, but everyone knows that 90% of the iceberg's under the water. You don't see it, it's hidden. And so the manifestations of these disorders, the clinical symptoms, the stuff you might see on the scans, the brain atrophy in certain regions, and the appearances of the cell under the microscope, all these things that medicine looks at because they're more obvious are sort of the tip of the iceberg. But the true process that's gone awry, that's been there for decades before the tip emerges, is all under the water, and that's 6 different levels of impaired mitochondrial biology, which we go through in the paper in illustrious detail and compile evidence from people with all these disorders over the last few decades and show that and then we go, what are the triggers causing all this at the base of the iceberg? And it's things that, that we know about: toxic exposures early in life, abnormal dietary lifestyle being a big one, lack of exercise being a big one, loneliness being a big one, and in a few people, genetic mutations as well. But that's only about 10 to 15%. So if you want to read about that paper, I suggest go read the paper. It's not the hardest read, it's not the easiest read, but I think it should be understandable by most people.
No, I thoroughly recommend it. I think it's a great paper. It's an important one in the field, and I hope in decades to come we'll look back on these type of ones as seminal. You can hope with that. Hey, Matt, I want to finish with something that's not anything to do with metabolic therapies, and I think this line of questioning hopefully won't surprise you, but I think it's an interesting thing. And it relates to the sort of behavioural side and the way that a particular clinical specialist interacts with their clients or patients, whatever name you want to give them, the people that they want to provide care for. I actually want to do it in the context of my son, Jackson, who had developed some functional neurological issues. And when it ended up, and I do this for anyone else who actually ends up with this, because it turns out there's some really easy solutions that you presented that are not known at all by the rest of the neurological community. So he started having some sort of spaced out episodes, couldn't function in his day-to-day life. We went to various neurologists, ruled out more serious things. They diagnosed it as this functional neurological disorder. But my experience of this is very different than my experience of working with you and actually other really good medical people, because it's not germ theory to the bitter end, it's something else about medicine. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about this. Something else about medicine that's perhaps a little condescending, but the diagnosis is pronounced. And often in this case, it was like, well, you're just going to be stuck with that for the rest of your life, and don't worry, it's not fatal. And that was the end of it. And it turns out, for this particular thing, that a really simple explanation in terms of hardware and software, particularly for a young man who's a software engineer, is thoroughly convincing and changes everything. Can you just, I don't know what you make of even what I'm trying to say, but I hope you sort of get the idea that there's also a way that medicine interacts with people that's sometimes very inhuman, and you bring a very different approach, and how you've noticed yourself doing that and why you do that, and then perhaps talk about the FND.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad he sounds like he's improved. That's great to hear, because I haven't seen him in a while. Look, I think the medical system makes patients reliant on the medical system. It's disempowering. You have to go see your doctor, who's going to do a checkup, and he or she is going to prescribe you the meds and give you the meds, and have you been taking your meds, and are you moving enough, and are you eating too much? You should eat less and move more. And it's very prescriptive, and here's what I recommend you do, please do it, kind of thing. And that has its uses, definitely, but it is a bit condescending, as you say, and I know a lot of doctors aren't satisfied with it. So doctors really should be guides. I mean, most doctors, a surgeon obviously is different. A surgeon has to go in there and do their thing. But most doctors who are interacting with people, especially for functional neurological disorders, really should act as guides first and foremost, and help people to understand the disorder themselves and empower the person to change the disorder themselves. And that's the cool thing about metabolic therapy. That's the cool thing about the treatment for FND, as you mentioned. Just putting that one into perceiving it differently can make all the difference. So FND is a real bugbear of mine, because this, a lot of people viewing this won't know what functional neurological disorders are, and yet they know many people with them. Think of them as brain processing disorders. I don't like the term functional neurological. It's too wishy-washy. They're brain processing issues. The brain isn't processing information correctly. They are, in my mind, if you look at history, probably the oldest and most misunderstood neurological disorder in human history. They've probably been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and I think the old medicine men and shamans, people like that, would have treated these disorders very well, because the treatment would have been very amenable to their style of approach without any of the tools of modern medicine. And because we've adopted germ theory to the nth degree, our treatments of some of these other disorders, such as the FNDs, has gone awry and gotten worse. And this is a disorder that's called many different things. I have a lecture up on YouTube if you want to learn about it. It's only half an hour long, but people call these things hysteria.
I would say with that, Matt, that lecture is the only thing on the internet that does exactly what it's supposed to, as advertised on the label, and it's effective. And I found out about it from you, but I'll put a link to that. It's a fantastic video if anyone's got FND.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so it's just, it's really hard to understand what FND is. And if you have it, you understand, because it's absolutely disabling. But to a lot of other people, it's a problem with brain processing. So scans are usually normal, or there's a mild anomaly, a mild structural issue that might be part of the problem, but only a relatively minor part. And blood tests are usually normal, and the doctors examine the patient. And some doctors, I'm ashamed to say, still think the patient is putting it on or somewhat malingering or making it up. But it's not true. The brain is creating the symptoms at a subconscious level, and the conscious brain doesn't know what to make of it. And so you can get these incredibly complex neurological disorders arise, and the longer you leave them and treat them poorly, the worse they can get. And they're afflicting a lot more of our young people now. Generation Z, for example, gets a lot more of these than any other generation has, and that we know of. So, and the treatment is basically taking a person. I have this sort of 5-step approach, as you know. I take the person through it, and just, call it what it is, explain what it is. And the way you interact with a person people can tell if you don't believe what you're saying. Most people can tell, especially with FND. They tend to be, I find, a little more empathic than most. And that might be why they're so susceptible to these disorders, is that they can read other people a little better maybe. But anyways, it's not just what you say in helping a person understand a condition. It's how you say it and your own body language. And they can tell if you believe what you're saying or if you're just going through the motions, you know what I mean? And if you don't believe what you're saying, if there's no integrity there, then the outcome won't be good. So I think what we need to do is educate doctors more on what some of these other disorders really are, and keeping in mind that we should also be humble because we don't understand everything there is to understand about the brain and how these disorders arise. But I think maintaining humility, but trying to help people and most of all empower them to take charge of their own health is the key. Most people do want to get better, actually, and most people do want to have the tools to be able to do that themselves. They like a guide. A lot of people do need a guide, but the guide is there to help inform and point out possibilities and not tell you what to do. And I think that might be at least part of what you wanted me to say in a very wordy fashion.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think the other interesting thing there is, and I've heard you talk about this in other contexts, and I never put two and two together, is that much of what we perceive in the world, we think of it as incoming data that we're just processing. And while that's partially true, I now have come to understand from you that actually much of the way we construct the world goes the other way, the exact other way. And at least the version of FND that I understand is a problem in that processing.
Yeah, so the brain, it's counterintuitive. You think that the brain really senses the world as it is, but there's a lot of neuroscience evidence to support this thing called predictive processing or predictive coding, and that the brain constantly makes predictions about the world, and it's predicting what it's going to perceive, it's predicting what it's going to sense constantly, and those predictions can actually become much of reality rather than reality itself. And that's what goes wrong in FND is that the brain starts to generate its own version of reality, and it disables the person because they're no longer in touch with the reality to the extent that other people are. We all predictively process. So the brain generates a lot of its reality rather than sensing it. And that is a key thing to understand if you want to be good at treating FND. If you don't understand that, it will be very difficult for you to help other people with this very, very difficult disorder. This is probably with headache, the most common disorder we get referred at the neurology department at Waikato Hospital, along with headache, is functional disorders. So it's very common, and I'm sure everybody here knows at least a couple people with this disorder, even if it hasn't been diagnosed yet.
Interesting. Okay, last thing, unrelated. Let's talk about the GLP-1 agonist drugs. People will know these as Ozempic and Wegovy, but the weight loss drugs. Do they have any place in medicine? Can you see a situation where you would use these in neurology?
I haven't used them yet, but yes, I think it's a mistake to totally ignore one whole aspect, one whole class of medications or whatever. So look, the GLP-1s are very new. They're touted for weight loss, but there is emerging evidence in a lot of disorders that they can help, including things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So, and I can understand why they could help with those in some ways. But I think that the trouble with this is that we tend to, whenever a new thing comes on the market, see it as a miracle drug or a miracle cure. And we want we want it, so therefore it is. We desire so much that there's this panacea for everything that it becomes that in our heads, right? We generate that perception. And it's not until a few years go by that the side effects of whatever new drug become apparent. So, like every drug has had this, at some point or another, most drugs, I'd say. So I think with the GLP-1s, we just have to understand there are significant side effects that are emerging. Apparently, some people have died from it, a very small number, but some. They do induce muscle and bone loss disproportionately. This may not be a good thing in the long term. Are they good for people who are severely obese and disabled because of that, and they just need something to kickstart them, like training wheels? That maybe they'll be good. You keep them on for a certain period of time, and then you transition, ideally, into a metabolic strategy, fasting, low-carb diet, for example. So, yeah, I think they have a place, but I don't think it's going to be as big a place in, say, 10 or 20 years as we're envisioning it now. I think there'll be just one more tool in our armamentarium that we can use when we need to, but significant side effects are going to make themselves known in the next 5 to 10 years if history is any teacher, and it is, and we just have to wait for those side effects to emerge. But in the meantime, we shouldn't decide that they're all terrible. But there will be some people that benefit, I suspect, and we will use them for a long time, I hope, in some of those people for good.
So I suppose there's a couple of comments there. One is, it doesn't mean it's true here, but there isn't a diet drug in history that hasn't eventually been withdrawn because of its eventually unacceptable long-term effects. So that's the first thing to consider. The second thing is there is a lot of chat around GLP-1 agonist drugs, particularly with Alzheimer's disease at the moment. I wonder if it's just sort of starting to have some effect because it's essentially mimicking some improvement of metabolism. So, you are starting to get some form of mitohormesis, and not the magnitude is not as large, but you're not eating. You're now you're in a different metabolic shape. You're more insulin sensitive. So, the whole metabolic may have changed. So that's one thing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's like gastric banding, surgery to reduce the stomach's ability to take in large meals. So you eat smaller meals, and it's enforced fasting. So,
is there any evidence for? Is there any evidence for that in terms of neurological issues?
Good question. I don't know. There's definitely evidence that rates of cancer go down after that. For example, if a person loses weight because of that, they get less cancer afterwards. So it probably would have a good spillover effect, something like Alzheimer's. Maybe the data's out there, I'm just not aware of it. But yes, I mean, that's what I mean. A lot of these drugs do have everything that's good has a dark side, and everything that's bad has a silver lining. So the cool thing about metabolic therapies is all the sort of bad stuff is right at the start. The first few weeks that you start your fasting protocol or keto diet, you probably experience a dip in energy. Your performance probably goes down. You do that 5-day fast, I'll bet you your physical performance goes down. But if you keep at it and do it month after month, after a few years, even during the fast, your performance should go up. And maybe not as much as when you're not doing the fast, but you know what I mean. So the hard stuff's at the beginning. With medications, the hard stuff comes later. And so it's sort of like they make you feel great, and you get some improvement initially, and then it's not for a couple of years that you actually notice the dark side of many of these medications, such as the GLP-1s. So you just have to accept that there's nothing is 100% good and nothing that's 100% bad. Sometimes bad is good, sometimes good is bad. And you just have to be aware of the possibilities that can occur with whatever treatment protocol you're embarking on, whether it's germ theory-based medication or terrain theory-based metabolic therapy.
So what do you reckon in the end? a medicine in 100, 200 years' time will understand more fully how to map a terrain, or are we just going to keep following germ theory and AI and we'll end up in some sort of medical dystopia?
No, I think we have to adopt terrain theory to some significant extent. I think it's necessary because if we're going to actually prolong humanity, because the way we're going with germ theory now, I mean, the obesity and overweight rates in New Zealand are something like 70% of all people. It's something like close to half are pre-diabetic now, if you include type 2 diabetics, which you should. And I think it's over 90% have the metabolic syndrome. Our health is abysmal. It's abysmal. And that will impact brain and decision-making processes and what directions humanity takes in the future. So I hope in 100 years, we'll keep to 100 years out of 200, that we have a lot more terrain theory, and we have advances in germ theory as well. We have cool new drugs. We have cool new techniques. Maybe we have a lot less invasive surgical techniques and procedures. Maybe we have a lot more directly regenerative therapies for certain things, organs, for example. But really the foundation of all of that does need to be maximizing what we were born with, which is our mitochondrial pool within our body. And I do think that the sky's the limit with respect to health. I don't know how long humans can live with a solid degree of function and cognitive ability, but I suspect it's well past the age of 100 if you do the right things throughout life. So it's figuring out what those things are. So I hope that's the future of humanity, because we need older people like at age 100 who are functionally capable and not getting dementia, not in nursing homes, to help guide the younger generations. Otherwise, humanity is just going to keep making the same foolish mistakes that young generations tend to make without the wisdom of their elders. And, we do need that. I don't think we're going to get that wisdom from AI. So that's my envision of the future, but predictions are fraught with unexpected variables and black swan events. So I'm not gonna defend that position, that vision of mine too much.
So you're arguing strongly in favour of the Japanese gentleman that died at age 114 last week. He was actually hit by a car when he was out running, which I suppose.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
And he'd done multiple long runs and various other things. Was still going at 114.
Oh.
Unfortunately was hit by a car.
Amazing. Amazing.
But yeah. Here's my black swan event that I think will take us further down the rabbit hole before we bounce out. And I'm predicting,
sure.
Like it sounds really cool that every home would have its own Optimus robot. There's androids walking around, but
yeah,
I think that could be really bad, because to stop having to do any of the normal manual tasks around your house. Disney made movies about that, Wall-E and these things, and it doesn't end well. But I think that might be the thing that bounces us back out, because we realise we've got to be physically involved in life to do things. So watch the space in the next decade or two.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what AI is and what AI can do as well. But I think that goes beyond the scope of our conversation here, unfortunately.
Yeah, we'll wrap it up. I think. Thanks, Matt. I just appreciate you, what you do, and that sort of superhero.
Hey, it's Grant here. Thanks for listening to the Prevention and Cure Is podcast. We don't advertise, we're never going to, but we have one request for you, and one only. If you felt this show was worthwhile, can you please rate us, and please rate us 5 stars. That's it. Thanks very much.